Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I invited my fellow Lord High Artificer Sinivi to give us a quick rundown of what I think is the best Hatebear deck in cEDH, and also answer some of my questions about Stax in general. So please welcome Sinivi.
Hey everyone. I don't know, man. The take about it being the best Hatebear deck in cEDH, that's maybe a little bit of a hot take. I mean, I support it. I support your position, but I'm just saying. Not everyone will agree with that.
Well, it's a hot take, but I honestly think it's the best Hatebear deck in the cEDH. Yeah, Sinivi, it's really nice to have you here and talk to you in person for the first time. Actually, we've worked together on the Urza primer. Can you please introduce yourself really quickly? Who are you and what do you do in and for the cEDH community?
So my name is Tim. I play and brew a lot of decks. I don't know if I'd say that I do things for the community. I participate in the community. I'm happy to think of that as like a kind of like a spare time contribution. Like there are a lot of people who do a lot for the community in terms of making content, yourself included. Mm-hmm. I'm usually not among them. I tend to like to play more than I do to produce. I play pretty much every archetype of I think that exists in the format. My favorite tends to be disruptive decks that are more Stax oriented, rule of law oriented. Obviously I've played mono blue for a long time. I've played a lot of turbo. I also play various Tymna lists. I'm a bit of, I guess, what you would call a Tymna fanatic or simp, depending on what your position is on one of those two things. Yeah, Tymna's a good card, man. Yeah. So I have a couple of lists on the database. 2 or 3 of them are rule of law decks. Several of them are collaborative primers with lots of other people. But in general, I'm here today to proselytize about the virtues of win-con lists, stacks, and cEDH.
Yeah, that's exactly why I asked you to be here today. So I'm planning on doing a few videos on decks that showcase certain archetypes, and especially Staxy decks, because I think that Stax is the masterclass of cEDH. Your Tymna Kamahl deck is, in my opinion, the best Hatebear deck in cEDH, like I just said. Can you give us a quick rundown of the deck, please? Sure.
So the premise of this deck is pretty much just that you have everything that you need to win the game in the command zone. This sort of philosophy here just being that you get to conserve slots, focus on a very linear game plan, leverage an engine to keep that plan running, and close it out with Kamahl, all from the command zone. Tymna obviously synergizes very highly with your flyers and other various Hatebears who tend to have thick booties. Or who just are generally hard to block because of other synergizing effects like Sareth, the Viper's Fang. And the goal of the deck is, use that synergy and that draw power that Tymna provides from the command zone to build either a hard or a soft block, and then close out the game, actually win the game transactionally, often with Kamahl. This is one of the more difficult aspects, I think, of playing this deck is that you need to really understand what a soft block is, and it differs depending on what pod you're in, because of course your opponents can be in different colors, have access to different answers, but broadly speaking, the reason this works is because the format has homogenized around a very small number of answers or mass removal to various kinds of hate. So for example, for the most part, we've consolidated on 2 or 3 mass wipe spells. 3 really common examples are Dam, Toxic Deluge, and Cyclonic Rift. You play answers in your deck to these spells, and you need to know when one of any of those is coming, and you need to be able to play kind of proactively in that way, and that can be challenging. But for example, Dam and Cyclonic Rift are both shut off by Chalice or Prelate on 2, and Toxic Deluge is shut off by Yasharn, preventing the payment of life. So the premise in this deck is that you can obviate your opponent's abilities to have answers to your board state by picking the right hate piece.
It's very important to analyze your pot and, of course, the meta when playing Stax. So there are a lot of Hatebears to choose from for your deck list and for your meta. How do you go about choosing Hatebears and Stax pieces? Like you just said, you need specific cards for those common answers, but what other priorities do you have when choosing Hatebears?
So broadly, you want them to be efficient. There are a lot of kind of expensive Hatebears that do things that are kind of unique, but maybe not necessarily something that you need. A really common one that I see is Chancellor of the Annex. This is a nice effect at the beginning of the game, but generally speaking, does not fit anywhere else into your curve. So when I'm looking at Hatebears, I'm looking for some really important qualities. One of them is, does it do something or solve a problem that Rule of Law does not solve? Rule of Law tends to be an effect that solves most of the things that you are concerned about, e.g. other decks being able to win. So I want to know, does that effect do something that Rule of Law doesn't? And then after that, does it do something that Null Rod doesn't? Null Rod and Rule of Law effects are your kind of baseline for playable bears. Beyond that, you really do need to tune for, what you expect to see. I play a lot of the Hush effects in my personal list. I think that they're really good against things like Dockside and Thoracle. But if you are seeing more, Thrasios type builds, I might consider, and Kenrith type builds, I might consider something like Phyrexian Revoker ahead of those cards. Simply because of its ability to target, those generals with activated abilities.
So you kind of try to stop those A+B combos that are very common. Thus, Oracle, Demon Station, all of which require your opponent to cast at least 2 spells a turn. And then after that, it's kind of like just meta dependent. Do I need to stop activated abilities, or do I need to turn off artifacts, etc., etc. The deck, in my opinion, is just very well rounded, like you just said. You have everything you need in the command zone. So you play your Hatebears to disrupt your opponents. Your Hatebears then draw you cards through Tymna, and they can also close out the game with Kamahl. So you just really only need to play those Hatebears and use your commanders to generate card advantage and close out the game, making perfect use of what's already good and what's already on the board. What are some other pros of the list, and what are some other cons of that list?
So I think in general, one of the most compelling reasons to play a deck in this archetype is because you just don't need to spend slots on combo. You can devote your entire list to targeted answers for your meta or for redundancy in your Stax effects. The best thing after a first Rule of Law is either protection for that Rule of Law or a second Rule of Law. I think as a lot of the format understands.
Double down.
Having a list with your win con in your command zone really tightens up, what you're able to play main board. You don't really have dead draws. It's one of the more compelling things I think about playing a list like this. The more you draw with Tymna, the more power you put on the board, the faster you close the game, the harder it is for opponents to dig out. Very, very linear in that respect.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that approach. Just straight up, only good cards. I don't need a combo piece. I don't need a win con. I'm just going for good cards and close out the game with that. I really like that approach.
Weaknesses definitely include, like any Stax deck, mid-range matchups are incredibly challenging. Mid-range decks just tend to be able to sandbag their answers, their responses until late in the game, when they can spend a lot of resources and try to, uncounterably resolve a Cyclonic Rift, or across turns remove maybe their protection that you have for Rift and then Rift. So there's a lot of challenge with beating mid-range decks in the long game, simply because they're equipped with commanders that are, for example, like Kenrith, who himself can contest and attack you and win with combat damage simply because he can grow infinitely largely. There are challenges like Najeela, right? Like any kind of combat-based game plan can be tricky to deal with if you don't have the appropriate amount of blockers. Najeela specifically, just because she can go wide on other opponents and then come for you after she's gone infinite. It's like, it doesn't matter if you can block for yourself. If opponents can't block, she still does the thing. In general, mid-range archetypes are going to carry the kind of answers that we struggle to interact with depending on what we have on board. Obviously, Gilded Drake is a pain in the ass. The last thing you want to do is get Kamahl or Elish Norn Gilded Draked. We do have protection from that, but because you're playing under Rule of Law, your opponents are kind of incentivized to help other players break your lock. And so when you get to this place where someone's playing something like a Drake that is already hard to interact with, if you try to interact with it, your other opponents are generally going to try to disrupt you and prevent you from, maintaining your lock. So,
well, of course, because you have the lock, right?
Right. So mid-range matchups are tricky here and definitely a con.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I personally think that Stax and Hatebear-centric decks are the masterclass of cEDH. And one thing that makes Stax so incredibly hard to play is choosing what Stax piece to deploy and when to deploy it. The last thing you want to do is stop two opponents from doing anything and thereby enabling the third opponent to win the game without any further interaction from your other opponents. I've personally seen this happen way too often when playing against Staxy decks, and especially those that can't turn off their Stax pieces like Urza can. Like, the both of us know how to play Urza very well. We know that we can turn off those Stax pieces and then open up a way for our opponents to interact with someone who's trying to win, but in most like Rule of Law decks, you can't really do that. So sometimes you come into a situation where someone is trying to win, but you can't interact and you're also stopping your opponents from interacting. Is there a way to avoid this issue? And if so, how do I avoid getting into those kinds of situations when playing Staxy decks?
Yeah, there's a lot to this. I think I would start by saying that you cannot play this archetype without expecting to have to coach the table through a number of interactions. Being able to talk to your opponents and table talk your way through, hey, it's not advantageous to remove X, Y, or Z piece at this time because of, potential holes or opportunities for opponents to interact, is a very important part of playing this archetype. No matter what you do, no matter how you slice it, it's a critical piece of being able to succeed at Stax. You have to be able to explain to people what sequences look like, what lines look like, and convince them that like now is not the right time maybe to remove this piece. And that's going to be a negotiation, right? Because there are going to be times when people have things that you don't know about, and they might be right in trying to remove something, and so they'll push back on you. And without getting too far into the politics of it, just say that like this is a very political archetype. It's not like turbo or mid range where you're either just going to go fast or you're going to outgrind or just outvalue people in the long game. You really have to be quite political. That brings me to the second point here, which is that success on this archetype also means that you really understand the format. It's very difficult to play when you don't know, for example, what the win cons look like in your opponent's decks, what sequencing they really want to go for, what a favorable game state looks like for their deck, what answers they play to your permanents. These things are really, really, really crucial because we're in black, we're talking about the Abzan variant with Tymna Kamahl. And your unconditional tutors are perhaps one of the most compelling reasons outside of Tymna to play this variant, but you really have to be judicious with them. You have to know exactly what you're getting and you have to know exactly what the threats are. This is hard. It's not, you can't just walk into this understanding. You have to play. You have to play a lot of different types of players. You have to play a lot of different types of decks. And sometimes you're going to get surprised, right? Like sometimes, especially with the things like Boseiju and Otawara not consuming a spell and not really being like permanent based interaction that you can easily interact with, they're tricky, right? Like there's situations that come up now that didn't come up before. But in general, those two things are true. You should expect to be political, and you definitely want to put your time in to understand the format that you're playing against.
Yeah, deploying the wrong Stax piece at the wrong time can potentially like end the game for you because you're enabling someone to win.
Totally. You also need to pay attention to turn order. Like the player going first always has such an inertia advantage that in general, as a rule of thumb, I tend to try to target them. The amount of inertia and advantage that you get by going first is enough to warrant, I think, attention from the table. And so, depending on where you are on the pod, I often will index on player one and sometimes player two, insofar as like, what am I picking next? Like if I don't see good options with known information, I'm going to think about, okay, who are the advantaged players in this game? Like they're the ones that I have to target with Stax.
Makes
now.
sense, yeah.
And so it's usually player one and two. But sometimes, other players will get off to a crazy start and you want to like look to disrupt them. So short of any of the first two things, I think then you look for who has the mechanical or turn-based advantage and you want to target them.
Well, you use the information you have, and if you don't have any information from the board, then it's the first or second player because they have a huge advantage. Okay, well, that's good to know, really informative. So I'm actually trying, or I actually want to build a Epson-based Hatebear deck in the future, but I'm just still waiting for another commander that like kind of speaks to me, you know?
Sure.
Okay then, let's wrap this up now. Where do I have to go if I want to dive deeper into your deck and the deck in general, Hatebears and Stax in general?
So we actually have a server for Rule of Law as an archetype across the board. Lots and lots and lots of really experienced players there. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out the collective hive mind of the role nerds as it were on that server who put hundreds of hours into playing decks like this. I think the power of being around other players that spend a lot of their time playing like this is that their collective experience and expertise is always going to greatly exceed my own, your own play experience as you play the decks. So getting involved in the community is a great way to expand your perspective and get good insights about how to build the decks. So definitely drop by the Rule of Law server.
Perfect. You should definitely do that. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, Sinivi, for taking the time to be here and answer my questions. I appreciate it a lot. You guys can find all the links in the description box down below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to my channel for more content in the future. This is Eisenherz.
And this is Sinivi.
And auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.